She knocked 3 times. Not the aggressive kind of knock, not the polite kind either. It was somewhere in the middle, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd stood outside my door and practiced how to sound casual. I knew it was her before I opened it. I don't know how to explain that. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was something quieter than that, the door handle. 3 months ago, she had laughed walking out of this same door. Not a small laugh, a real one. The kind that meant she believed what she was saying completely. "You'll never survive without me." That's what she said. And I told her. Probably. Not because I believed it, not because I was broken. I said it because I was tired of performing strength for someone who had already decided I didn't have any. She left. I let her. And now she was standing on the other side of this door with that rehearsed knock and 3 months of whatever she'd been through written somewhere in the pauses between her breathing. I opened it. She looked the same, maybe a little thinner. Her expression was trying to be neutral, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. She said my name like a question. I didn't answer it. I just looked at her and waited. Because the man who would have rushed to fill that silence, the one who used to shrink himself to make her more comfortable, he wasn't standing at this door anymore. And she could already tell. We met when I was 26. She was sharp, confident, and certain about everything. At the time, I mistook that certainty for strength. I was still figuring out who I was, and she seemed like someone who had already solved that problem. So I leaned toward her the way people lean toward light when they've been in a dim room too long. We got married after 2 years. I worked in logistics management.
Steady work. Not glamorous, but I was good at it, and it paid well. She worked in marketing. Creative, fast-paced, full of opinions. She loved her job in a way that made everything else feel like a lesser version of what she did. That included me, eventually. It didn't start mean. It started small. A comment at dinner about how I didn't think big enough. A joke at a party about how she handled all the real decisions in the house. A habit of explaining things to me slowly, in front of others, like I needed the extra time to catch up. I told myself it was just her personality. She was direct. She was driven. Not everyone communicates the same way. But there's a difference between direct and dismissive. And somewhere in year 3, she stopped being one and became the other. The version of me that existed inside our marriage was smaller than the version that existed everywhere else. At work, I made decisions confidently. At home, I second-guessed everything. I once spent 20 minutes unsure whether to suggest a restaurant because I didn't want to hear why it was the wrong choice. That's not a personality clash. That's erosion. I just didn't have that word for it yet. The public moments were the worst. Not because they were loud. She was never the type to scream in a restaurant or cause a scene in the obvious way. Her version was quieter than that, and somehow more effective. It was the sigh before I finished a sentence. The way she'd look at her phone while I was talking to someone we both knew, like whatever I was saying wasn't worth her full attention. The correction. Always the correction. I'd tell a story and she'd interrupt and fix a detail that didn't matter. The restaurant was on 5th, not 4th. It was a Tuesday, not a Wednesday. It was raining, actually. Small things, but she did it consistently, and always in front of people. And after a while, those people started to look at me differently, like I was the forgetful one, the unreliable one.
The one who needed managing. Her friends thought she was funny. Mine got quiet when her name came up. My friend Daniel pulled me aside at a barbecue once. He didn't make a speech about it. He just said, "You good, man? You seem different lately." I told him I was fine. He nodded like he didn't believe me but wasn't going to push. But because she decided early on that I couldn't, I let it happen. Then she controlled the social calendar. Then the home decisions. Then the narrative of who we were as a couple. By year 4, the story she told about our marriage had almost nothing to do with reality. And I had let that story stand long enough that I'd have started to believe it too. It started over something small. That's how these things usually end. Not with a dramatic trigger, but with something ordinary that finally has too much weight behind it. I had made a decision without consulting her. Nothing major. I had agreed to help my brother move the following weekend without checking with her first. She found out when he called the house to confirm. She didn't yell. She sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and looked at me the way a manager looks at an employee they've already decided to let go. She said I was inconsiderate.
She said I always did this. She said I made impulsive decisions without thinking about how they affected other people, meaning her, and that she was exhausted from compensating for me. I listened, and then something shifted. I told her, calmly, that helping my brother move was not a decision that required her approval, that I was his brother, that this was not a complicated situation. She escalated. I stayed level. She told me I didn't appreciate what she contributed to our life.
That I had no idea how much she managed, how much she carried, how far behind we'd be without her holding everything together. I asked her what exactly she thought I couldn't handle. That's when she said it. She stood up, picked up her keys, and said if I thought I was so capable, then maybe I should find out what surviving on my own actually looked like. I told her that was her choice to make. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh exactly, more like the laugh of someone who already knows the punchline. You'll never survive without me. I looked at her and said, probably. She walked out. The door closed. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same spot she'd just been, and I didn't move for a long time. Not because I was devastated, because I was finally, completely still. The first week was the quietest I'd ever experienced inside my own home. Not empty quiet, not grief quiet. Just space. More of it than I expected, more than I knew what to do with at first. I didn't call her. She didn't call me. I went to work on Monday. I came home. I made dinner for one, which felt strange for about 4 days and then just felt normal. I noticed I was making things I actually wanted to eat. Small detail, but it registered. By the second week, I started getting practical. I pulled up the finances, the accounts she had managed since year one. I expected to feel lost. I didn't. The system she used wasn't complicated. It was just hers. I restructured it into something I understood better and found 2 subscriptions we'd been paying for that neither of us used. $43 a month. Gone. That sounds minor. It wasn't minor to me. It was the first decision I had made about our shared life in years that was entirely clean. No negotiation. No approval. No sideways look across the table. I called Daniel. We got dinner. I told him what happened. Not the dramatic version. Just the facts. He listened. At the end, he said, honestly, I'm not surprised. Then he asked if I needed anything.
I said no. He said, okay. That was it. That was enough. I started running in the 3rd week, not as a statement, not as a transformation montage. I just had extra time in the mornings, and my body needed something to do with the tension that had nowhere to go. I ran 3 days a week, short distances, nothing impressive, but I slept better almost immediately. Work got sharper too. Without the low-grade anxiety of managing her moods, I noticed I was thinking more clearly at my desk. A project I'd been slow-walking for 2 months got finished in 3 weeks. My manager mentioned it. I didn't explain why. I just said I'd found some focus. I heard from her once, around week 5. A text, short. It said she hoped I was doing okay and that we should probably talk about logistics at some point. I replied that same evening. I said I was doing fine and that whenever she was ready to discuss logistics, I was available. She didn't respond for 11 days. I didn't wait for her response. That's the thing about rebuilding quietly. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. Every morning I woke up in a home that felt more like mine than it had in years. Every decision I made landed without friction. I wasn't performing recovery. I was just living. And somewhere around week 10, I realized I hadn't thought about her dismissal in days. Not because I'd suppressed it, because it had genuinely lost its weight. She had handed me a verdict. You won't survive. And I had simply disproved it without sending her the results. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't waiting. I was just done proving anything to anyone. Which is exactly where I was standing when she knocked on my door 3 months after she walked out of it. She asked if she could come in. I stepped back and let her through. Not because I was glad she was there, because I wasn't going to have the conversation I knew was coming while standing in a doorway. She looked around the apartment the way people do when they're trying to read a room without appearing to, taking inventory. I watched her eyes move across the space. I sat across from her. She started with small talk, how I'd been, whether work was busy. I answered honestly and briefly. I wasn't cold. I wasn't performing distance. I was just exactly as present as the conversation warranted, which wasn't very much yet. Then she got to it. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking, that the months apart had given her perspective, that she recognized some of the ways she had behaved weren't fair, and that she hadn't fully appreciated what we had until it wasn't there. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. It wasn't a bad speech. It was genuine in places. I could hear the parts that cost her something to say. She wasn't a person who admitted fault easily, so the moments where she pushed through that resistance were visible. I gave her credit for them internally. But I was also listening for something underneath the words. What I heard was this. Things had been harder than she expected. The confidence she'd walked out with had met reality somewhere in those 3 months, and reality had pushed back. She hadn't said that directly. She didn't need to. I knew her well enough to hear what wasn't being said. She finished. She looked at me. And then she said she thought maybe we owed it to ourselves to try again. That people grew. That she had grown. But she was asking me to consider it. The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at her. Really looked. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Not the pull I would have felt 2 years ago, when her attention still felt like something I needed to earn. Just clarity. Clean, steady clarity.
The kind that tells you exactly what the next sentence needs to be before you've even decided to say it. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant that. It takes something real to sit across from a person you left and admit that leaving didn't fix what you thought it would fix. I wasn't going to dismiss that. But then I told her the truth. I said that what she described, the growth, the perspective, the recognition, those were good things, real things, and they belonged to her. She should keep them. They'd serve her well. But they didn't change what I knew now. I told her that the version of me she wanted to come back to wasn't available anymore. Not because I was punishing her, not because I was still angry. I wasn't, and I needed her to understand that clearly. But because the dynamic she was proposing to return to had required me to be smaller than I actually was. And I was done being that size. She started to say that things would be different. I told her I believe she believed that. But belief isn't a structure. Belief is a starting point. And the structure we had built together over 4 years had a specific shape. One where her certainty took up most of the room, and my judgment was treated as a liability. That shape didn't disappear because 3 months had passed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if there was anything she could do. I said, build something different with someone else, or build it alone first. But don't build it on top of what we had, because that foundation wasn't stable for either of us. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. That felt right for her. She held things tightly, even grief. She stood up, picked up her bag. At the door, she paused and said she was sorry. I told her I know. She left. This time, I didn't sit still at the table. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window while it brewed. I won't tell you it didn't hurt. It did. Not that final conversation. That one was clean. But the 4 years before it, the slow giving away of ground I didn't realize I was giving, the version of myself that got comfortable being doubted, that part cost something real, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What I kept was worth more than what I lost. I kept my judgment, my steadiness, the knowledge that I could run a life without someone else's hand on every dial. Those things were always mine. I had just stopped acting like it. The lesson wasn't that she was a villain. She wasn't. She was a person who had been allowed to expand until she filled every available space. That happens when no one holds a boundary long enough for it to mean anything. I had handed her that permission quietly, over years, one small concession at a time. That was on me too. What I know now is simple. Surviving without someone isn't the hard part. The hard part is noticing, early, clearly, before the erosion goes deep, when a relationship is asking you to be less than you are, and then deciding that's not a price you are willing to keep paying. She said I'd never survive without her. I said probably. What I meant, even if I didn't have the words for it then, was this. Surviving was never the question. The question was always whether I was willing to stop shrinking. Turns out I was. That's not a victory. It's not a tragedy either. It's just what happened when I finally stopped arguing with someone about my own worth and started living like I already knew it.